Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nick Lazez from GRC Solutions. Thank you for logging in today to join us for the webinar on Restoring Team Culture After a Workplace Incident with Nathalie Nuijens. If you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A section of the Zoom applet. The answers to any questions and the video recording will be provided via email to all who registered. I will now hand over to Nathalie to begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Hope you're all well, and thank you for joining me for today's section, How to Restore Team Culture After a Breach. Just let me quickly tell you a little bit about myself and today's sessions first. I've worked in learning and content development for a lot of years, and the last 6 years I've been with GRC Solutions. Now, I'm sure you'll know their e-learning for compliance products sold, but we're also offering blended learning and workshops. I'm working as a consultant, which is a great role because I'm one of those who's lucky to work closely with clients, get insights into many different organizations and see some of the problems they face and help them develop creative solutions. Now, over the past few years, we started noticing a common trend in how organizations deal with breaches. I think that businesses are really switched on in the way they're dealing with breaches. Most have great reporting lines and systems in place. And if something does happen, then immediately a whole train of procedures is set into motion. However, there's always that however. An area that's generally not given much thought is the wider effect a breach has on employee motivation, productivity, and retention rates. So in this situation, you can't simply apply the standard team motivational strategies because if there's an ongoing police investigation, you simply can't communicate the details. And obviously, you also have to respect the privacy of the victim. And obviously, you don't want leaks to the media either. So in today's session, I'd like to tell you about some of the practical solutions I've seen clients put in place. And I'd also like to talk to you about a case study so you have a better understanding of how processes could be put in place. Now, these are the lessons I've learned from my clients and that I think will be useful to many of you. Okay, let's get started. So let's have a look at today's key takeaways. I'd like to talk a little bit about workplace regulation and breaches and have a look at some of the common breaches that occur. We're also looking at a case study that analyzes how a breach can affect the wider business. And then we're moving into the area of prevention. I've seen some really smart ways put in place to prevent breaches that I think could be useful for you all. And then at the end, there's the opportunity to ask questions, of course. And on that, Nick's already mentioned it, but can I just ask you to save your questions to the end, please? All right, thank you. Okay, conduct risk. There's a lot of talk about conduct risk, culture and engagement at the moment. So let me just start by framing my definition so that we're all on the same page. I think this is important. I'd also like to point out the difference between conduct risk and compliance. And don't worry, this is the only technical slide in the presentation. So bear with me. And after this, we'll get into the practical side of things. So what is conduct risk and why is it such an issue? Well, the official definition of conduct risk is the risk of inappropriate, unethical, or unlawful behavior on the part of an organization's management or employees. Now let's talk about compliance. Most of you will know that depending on what type of organization you work for, there are many compliance obligations. They can be mind-boggling complex, and I hear many complain that there's way too many rules. Now, a good compliance program helps an organisation in meeting their obligations and to really reduce the risk of the organisation breaking the law. The Australian standard on compliance programs says that a compliance program will result in an organisation, and here's another definition, being able to demonstrate its commitment to compliance with relevant laws, including legislative requirements, industry codes, organisational standards, as well as standards of good corporate governance, ethics, and community expectations. Now, according to this Australian Standard 3806, an effective compliance program is supported by 12 principles. And they talk about, the basic principles of commitment, implementation, monitoring, measuring, and improvement. The 7th principle is relevant to today's session, and that's the one that says competence and training needs are identified and addressed to enable employees to fulfill their compliance obligations. This basically means that an organisation has to train their employees, but it can also use training as a tool in the prevention and resolution of a breach. But I'll talk a bit more about that later. Okay, we've made it through the theoretical bit, and now we're going to look at why it's important. So why are all these rules in place? Well, I think we all want to work in a safe environment. We want to work in an environment that is free from harassment and discrimination. We want businesses to compete on a level playing field so that we all get a good deal, right? We want governments to be free of bribery and fraud. We want our organisations to deal with ethical suppliers and third parties. And we want Australia's natural landscape and wildlife to be protected for next generation by environmental rules. And so there's 100 more reasons. Now, as I just said, there are hundreds of rules and laws in place, but unfortunately, that doesn't mean that those rules are applied by everyone. And that leads, wrong slide, and that leads to workplace breaches. Let's have a look at some recent examples. A very common area of breach is diversity and inclusion. So this is all about bullying and harassment, and it's a very prominent issue at the moment. There's a lot of discussion about what you can and can't say or do at work. For example, maybe you'll remember former Army Chief and current Australian of the Year, David Morrison, saying a while ago that Australians should stop using the word guys at work. That's one example, but there's also a lot of publicity around breaking the glass ceiling for women at work. Often that's referred to as the bamboo ceiling for Australians of Asian descent, and so it goes on. Another really big topic at the moment is fraud, bribery, and corruption. The World Economic Forum estimates that more than 5% of global GDP, so that's $2.6 trillion US, goes through bribery. The World Bank says that over $1 trillion US is paid in bribes every year. I mean, that's a phenomenal amount. But looking more locally and looking at Australia, I read a recent Business Insider report that said that more than 1 in 4 Australian executives believe that bribery is more widespread now than it was 2 years ago. And the pressures they face at work really bring out the worst in some. 25 of the executives actually justify unethical behaviour to meet financial targets. And I don't know if many of you would have seen last night's Four Corners program on the ABC, but that was really a great example of that. Now, one of the areas where a breach has an immediate, huge impact is in safety at work. If work health and safety fails, it basically means that somebody gets injured badly, or even worse, dies. I read an article last week about a breach that attracted the second largest fine in New South Wales history. In New South Wales history. So a construction company based in Sydney and its director were fined $425,000 and $85,000 respectively, following the death of a 55-year-old bricklayer who basically fell 5 meters at the site. And the tragic thing was that this accident was completely preventable had the right protection been put in place. Privacy and data breaches. Now, I won't go near last week's census because I think there's still debate on whether it actually was an overseas hack or not. But privacy is another huge topic at the moment. Social media, digitalizations, the law still needing to catch up. It's huge. But there's always been breaches in privacy. I remember a great story a good few years ago where a doctor's practice moved to a different location and a few heavy filing cabinets with patient files were placed outside the building, and the removalists sort of forgot they were there and left them there. So everything was moved to the new practice and nobody noticed those actual cabinets were missing for a week. Now imagine that. Goodness knows how many people could have gone through all those files. So that's an old example, but still a relevant one. Any others? Yeah, other areas? Look, there are so many areas and examples of damage. Again, one recent example that concerns corporate governance comes from Clive Palmer. So his company, Queensland Nickel, was liquidated in April. I believe there were debts of more than $770 million. And later on, Queensland government said it will cost about $93 million to begin the cleanup of environmental damage at the Jabiluun nickel refinery. Now, there just wasn't any money set aside for the cleanup. And this debate has been ongoing for a couple of months, and I'm not sure what the outcome of this will be and how the site will be cleaned up. There's an ongoing debate between Clive Palmer and the Queensland government, both arguing that the other one should pick up the bill. But the reports of damage keep flooding in, so that's just another example. So these were examples of what a breach can look like. But what happens when there is a breach? Look, first there's your investigation. All the focus goes on to who's the perpetrator, what has happened, and usually involved are HR, risk, compliance, IT, if it's a financial breach or if it involves money, accounts, and the board. I read a stat recently that 70% of data breaches are reported by third parties, such as bank, noticing strange behaviour or strange occurrences in accounts. So rather than the organisation itself. So if you're unlucky, the police is involved too, right from get-go. Weeks of investigations later, the issue has been resolved, the perpetrator has been sanctioned, and a board report has been written. Done? Well, not really. What about the impact on the wider business? Generally, not much thought is given to the other employees. I heard of a recent fraud case that had 5 departments involved, and though nobody in the wider business officially knew, everybody had cottoned on that something was wrong. Because of the confidentiality and the sensitivity of the issue, no official statements were made, but the team didn't know where they stood or what to expect. It's a bit like announcing company restructure. Immediately, everybody will start worrying about being made redundant, and productivity levels just instantly drop. Now, facing a breach is, in a way, inevitable. Every company will have to deal with one at some stage, so you can only hope it's a minor breach. But how can you boost morale after such an event? Just Google team morale and you get a million hits. But they all boil down to these basic 3 steps. First one, honesty. Be honest about what happened to those closest to the event. And if you can, Be transparent. This is often a challenge with legal breaches, as there are laws protecting the employee, and obviously any ongoing investigations cannot be disturbed. But transparency is very important, especially if staff are getting distrustful and they don't know what's going on. Communication, again, this can be tricky due to ongoing investigations or laws requiring you to remain silent. But is there another way you can acknowledge the situation? Well, pretending nothing happened has never fooled anyone, so that's always your worst option. As I mentioned before, it has a huge knock-on effect on employees, so you want to let them know that there will be no ramifications for them. And then the third one is educate. If you can't be honest, if you can't communicate, you can reinforce what it means to be part of your organization and what is expected of them during the time of work, or even outside of work if you're including things like social media. If you invest in your employees and send out a positive message, they'll know that their jobs are secure and stable. From a legal and governance perspective, I think this is also a very smart way to deal with the ripple effect of a breach. Do you remember what we spoke about at the start? So the 7th principle of the Australian Standard 3806 says, competence and training needs are identified and addressed to enable employees to fulfill their compliance obligations. Okay, I'd like to give you an example of this. So we recently worked with a client who was determined to look at the wider effect a bullying incident had had on their business. The team in which the breach had occurred was traditionally one of the better performing teams. But after the breach, HR noticed that sick leave was going through the roof. Managers reported that staff would just disappear for hours, long lunches. Projects barely moved along and targets just weren't met. Here are some of the key facts. So the client is a large international multidisciplinary firm. The issue, it was a serious breach of workplace behaviour standards. The client wanted a quick solution. It had to be effective. It had to impact culture. And it had to be cost effective and measurable at the same time as well. I'm talking about requirements. Client outcomes, they wanted to minimize the risk of reoccurrence. They wanted a more tolerant and better functioning team. And the outcome for the attendees was really around reassurance, trust, increased knowledge, and awareness of the issue. Now, this business is extremely people-friendly. They go the extra mile to make sure that they hire and retain the best people, and their core values are a fully integrated part of the workplace. So values around diversity and inclusion in the workplace are communicated through a purposely created network that happens on a regular basis. It's reinforced by policies, use of inclusive language. They have yearly e-learning for compliance. And you know what? It still went wrong. So the HR team got together and workshopped a number of options how to get everyone back on board. Now, no company statement could be made, so pep talks by management were ruled out, and it was just before the school holidays, meaning many would go on leave. So individual catch-ups were ruled out too. HR got talking to compliance, and they actually suggested training, and so they contacted us with the request to develop a training session. It had these following aims. So reinforce the company values. So that was really all about code of conduct and ethics of the business. Emphasize the illegality of bullying and harassment, what the penalties are, and the hidden costs of the business. So that's really focusing on the legal aspect of it. And then they wanted to provide a safe forum where team members, as individuals, can add personal insights, contribute their own suggestions, ask questions, and voice concerns. And that was really all about trust and empowerment. Now, their request was very unusual because normally the focus lies on formal conduct only. So we had to be really creative with the solution. Now, we worked very close with the HR team, working out what had happened, and we're trying to understand the surrounding circumstances. Because for the workshop to be a success, we had to include the honesty and communication aspects and mix it into the education mix. Sounds tough? Oh, it was. We kept going back to the issue and making sure it was practical, positive, applicable to employees, and slowly, bit by bit, we got there. An interesting fact is that the client emphasized that they wanted to focus on a positive message. So we settled for an underlying thank you message. So thank you for being a valuable member of this team, and thank you for being a spokesperson for our company. So the million-dollar question, did it work? Well, it actually did. After a good half hour of cross-armed and skeptical sideways look, the team actually started engaging. They started to interact, volunteer information, and then they started to discuss the issue. Hooray! As a neutral outsider, I wasn't seen as a threat, and without a manager there, the team felt really comfortable to share their thoughts. So that went really well. And it was reported back to me afterwards that the mood had settled down dramatically. HR had received a few requests for personal one-on-one chats. And slowly everything settled back down again. 6 months later, all the team members, except for the ones that were directly engaged in the breach, are still there. So that's really showing retention rates are as high as they always were. And that's a fantastic outcome, and really credit to the company for being so open and engaged with us. All too often, we deliver a generic workshop because the brief is there is no issue, and then it transpired during the workshop that actually there is. And that's a missed opportunity. So let's just look at the outcomes. So for HR, imagine all the cost, the time, and the effort they would have incurred if they hadn't acted. For legal, reinforcing the compliance message will really help prevent any future breaches. For the board, it had quick results, it was measurable as they wanted, and it was a relatively small investment. The employees went on holidays, felt reassured. So it just shows you how thinking outside the box can deliver a good outcome. Okay. Other techniques promoting engagement. Now, engagement, I can talk another hour on this topic alone, but try some of the more common practices that are out there. And I particularly like these four. Touching base regularly. So work on creating stronger relationships by having regular contact and communication, and listen. I think this is all about your honesty and communication factors. Secondly, develop your team. This goes back to education, but instead of focusing on the area of breach, have a look at training in a wider sense. Are there any skills that you can train employees on that they could use in their daily jobs? If you give employees the opportunity to develop new skills, they'll feel valued and they'll easily re-engage. The office, this one is really basic, but it gets overlooked so often. How can we improve the office atmosphere? Free fruit, a monthly bake-off, plans. All these things really help, but I have to point that out, for a short while. They won't sustain engagement in the long term. It's great to give an engagement that initial boost. And finally, rewards. Have a look at developing a reward system. So what's the business working towards, and how does that translate to individual KPIs, and how will you celebrate when you get there? Lots you can do. So before I briefly touched on the subject of preventing a breach. Now, I think you'll agree that it's impossible to ever fully prevent a breach. Risk management rule number 1 states that as a business, you always run risks, and it's always about making calculated risks. Now, one of the key factors in preventing a future breach, and I cannot emphasize this often enough, is culture. There's a lot of talk about culture at the moment. I think the best way to frame this is by saying that a company's culture is really the way we do things around here. So ask yourself, how are things done around here? Do we live and breathe our values? What sort of culture are we promoting? Do we effectively communicate our corporate values? Do all employees understand how we expect them to behave? So, how does culture develop? Organizational cultures develop over time by employees recognizing what behavior is acceptable and what's not. That's really how simple it is. The responsibility for framing company culture lies with the CEO. So they play a key role in determining the personality of the organization and sets its ethical tone. The implementation lies with senior management, who's basically expected to lead by example. And once established, the culture of an organization should flow through all aspects of the business. So that includes hiring staff, communication with clients, and obviously relationships among colleagues. Can it be changed? Well, not with a single training course or implementing a code of conduct. These are very effective tools, but they need to be part of a greater picture, of a bigger system. Cultures are created over time through habitual behavior and long practice. I read somewhere the other day that you have to do something 10,000 times for it to become a habit. So, don't even worry applying a quick fix. Look at the bigger picture. However, before an attempt can be made to change an organizational culture, it's really important to understand how it was shaped in the first place. So many resources are available to help organizations understand and then change their cultures. They're usually survey-based, so it may be necessary to use one of those initially to identify what cultural attitudes or behaviors are undermining change initiatives. Okay, let's have a look at prevention now, third part. When you're trying to put a system in place that may prevent a breach, there are really 4 areas you need to look at. So tone from the top. And that's really around establishing culture. As I mentioned before, it needs to be implemented by senior management and set by the CEO. So management really needs to show leadership in this area. Company culture, the way things are done around here. Values and ethics. This is also a very important one. It's making right decisions without strict rules. You can have so many policies and codes in place, but the reality is that employees are going to face situations when there's no textbook solutions. I mean, look at gifts and entertainment as part of a bribery and corruption policy, for example. You can have the best policy in place, but you're just going to have to trust that employees will declare that expensive bottle of wine and share the chocolates with colleagues. There are many, many grey areas. Policy frameworks, again, supporting efficient management and good governance. Smart measures. Now, my colleagues and I work with many organisations on the development of risk profiles and putting frameworks in place. I've come across some really smart measures that some of those companies have put in place. So company research and survey. I mentioned earlier that as part of an effective way, that's part of an effective way to find out how culture works in an organisation. 2-minute chats. I think out of all of them, this is my favourite one. It's a quick and simple solution that I've seen a few times. So at the start of every meeting, somebody within the team will have a quick chat about a specific risk issue that was decided by the company. So it can be a work health and safety hazard that somebody spotted on their way to work. Then it's a 2-minute safety moment, or an article in the paper that somebody read about financial fraud, someone noticing that the person handling their food at lunch wasn't wearing any gloves, and so on. That's a really great one. Targeted workshops. Again, another thing to consider are targeted workshops that come after the policies have been read and the e-learning has been done. So they must look at practical application on the job. And here you can really address some of the issues that employees have, and nip any potential issues in the bud. Group discussions about safety and risk issues. Now again, this is a great one. Not only do you get employees to think about an issue, but you actually learn what affects those in the thick of it most. It's a great one. Compliance network. Now this is a system that's incorporated throughout the system. Review your policies. Here's another one. Make sure that they're up to date. Make sure that they're short and to the point, practical, relevant, and that people actually understand them. We review so many policies, and often companies try to include everything as much as they can into their policies. And that often has the result that employees look at it and go, oh, don't get about half of this. So make them short, to the point, and practical so that people can easily apply them in their daily jobs. Weekly compliance updates. So for example, a message communicated to staff every week, updating them on issues that are worked on or safety issues being met. There's lots of things. Developing solutions. So when you're developing a solution, look at these key questions. Who is your audience? What problem are you trying to solve? How do you know you've solved it? How does it translate to common areas of breach, such as diversity, bribery, social media, work health and safety? Let me give you some examples. So, for example, on diversity and inclusion, what can and can't you say? A manager can't talk about my team, or you can talk about my team, but you can't talk about my girls, and so on. And what do you want to say if someone looks nice? Another topic, work health and safety, really safety in the office, on site. But don't forget, for example, working from home. So many people working from home these days. How do you make sure they stay safe? Social media. Social media is incredible, and it's getting bigger and bigger. It's now more common that people get sacked after posting rude or rude posts on Facebook. I've now seen that a couple of times, and it's a really big issue, and lots of organizations are struggling with it. It's actually surprising how many organizations don't have a strong social media policy in place, still taking that approach that that's what happens outside of work. Well, it doesn't always. Bribery and corruption, again, as I mentioned before, it's a huge topic. The latest Corruption Perceptions Index, which is published by Transparency International, shows that Australia is actually no longer perceived as being one of the safest in the world. So in the latest publication, so that was 2015, Australia was ranked as the 13th cleanest country to do business with, and that was down from 8th in 2011. So this slowly sliding down. And finally, I'd like to share this success story of how company culture can be turned around. So I'm sure you've all heard of Walmart before, and they're the American multinational retail corporations. They've got big supermarkets, department stores, and it's one of the many companies that has faced widespread criticism for a so-called toxic culture. A scandal in 2012 resulted in the departure of several high-ranking executives, including its general counsel, and also the longest-running investigation that has cost Walmart at least $500 million US. So the outline of Walmart's mistakes at the time were that the company's CEO and general counsel in Mexico orchestrated bribes and doctored records for clearance to open new stores across the country, and that was in the early 2000s. One whistleblower complaint in 2005 sparked an investigation, but it actually didn't amount to any significant cleanup. So a few years later, as the company's business in Mexico expanded, the New York Times investigated the retailer's operations and really uncovered the truth behind its sudden growth, and that was widespread bribery. So while the regulatory investigations have been incredibly expensive, the retailer took a positive stance and said, look, we're taking this opportunity to recreate our global compliance and culture program. So they added 30% more compliance staff. They were dealing with its culture of silence, making sure that that one whistleblower would spark a proper investigation next time, all those kinds of measures. They rolled out new training initiatives, reporting mandates, and that was really trying to stop this behavior from ever happening again, but also for everyone else to be involved. They also appointed a new global chief of ethics and compliance who basically worked around the clock to change the culture. And it took a few years, but in 2014, Walmart published a global compliance report that explained all the efforts it made to improve their ethics and compliance and what the results were. Now, it turns out that the changes have made such an impact on the company culture worldwide that Walmart's compliance team is now referred to as one of the leaders in compliance, with incidents of breach at an all-time low. And that's not due to a lack of reporting or a culture of silence. It's a real great example of how dedication and focus can put in place. If it's put in place in a good way, it's a really good prevention mechanism. Okay. I'd like to open the forum for any questions now. Let me just see what we've got here. Any questions? Yeah, here's a question. Thank you. Can you tell me a bit more about the 2-minute chats? The 2-minute chats, sure. So this is part of the wider system where compliance or HR decide on a certain risk area for the business. So they really, from their perspective, they decide what the focus is for, I don't know, for a good few weeks or for a month. So they make that the company's focus. So emails are sent out relating to the issue. Maybe a workshop is facilitated around the issue. And then there's the quick chats. So at the start of every meeting, someone will stand up and share a story of what they've noticed relating to the issue. So as I mentioned before, it can be a newspaper article, it can be something they've seen on their way to work, and so on. The great advantage of this is that you get everyone involved and focused on the issue with a relatively small investment. So only 2 minutes of every meet. Yeah, so it's only 2 minutes of every meeting. Okay. Any further questions? Okay, I see we're starting to run out of time, so I'll take one more question before we wrap up. What type of gifts should be reported at work? Look, this is a grey area and really should be set by the organisation in its policies. There are examples of suppliers who send everyone within a team an invitation to a corporate box at a sports event, just at the time when a contract is up for renewal. I think it's really important to communicate that it's okay to accept something of nominal value, unless you work in government, obviously. Then the person will always have to pay for their own cup of coffee. But by definition, something of nominal value is a cap, a pen, that kind of thing. But it's really up to the organisation what limit to set. Actually, most organisations I encounter set it at $50. So everything above that should be reported, and also that it doesn't mean that it gets confiscated. It just means that it gets a tick of approval. That's very important to remember. Okay, everyone. I think we've run out of time for this session. Feel free to get in touch if you have any further questions. Please email me if you have any questions. I'd love to get in touch with you. And part of the success of it and the strength of this presentation is really because so many clients have been sharing their knowledge and the tips. So if you have something to contribute, please get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. Also, if you'd like some more information about the types of workshops we develop, please feel free to email me. And again, thank you very much for your time. I hope you found it useful, and I look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the day. Cheers, bye.
Hi all, again, thank you all for joining. The answer to these questions and any other questions submitted to the Q&A section, along with a recording of this webinar, will be provided via email to all who registered. Thank you.